scares the bejesus out of you, you know? I mean, of course.
Yeah.
Because you got, the father disappears and you've got the shaking electrical razor and the sink.
And the plane that's flying itself. And
clothing laid out across the sidewalk where, somebody's walking along one moment, the next moment. I guess you don't need clothes in the Rapture. Anyway, I never knew why the clothes didn't go, but...
Western Christianity has spent the last 2,000 years telling everyone they're separated from God.
This is Not Church with John and Nat Turney.
Welcome back to another episode of This Is Not Church. John, my brother, and I are here with our friend, Father Kenneth Tanner. If you don't know who Kenneth Tanner is, get online, stop what you're doing, stop listening to this podcast, and look him up on Facebook. Be blessed, be encouraged. This is a guy who is genuinely, I think, doing just amazing stuff, putting out amazing content. But he is the pastor of the Church of the Holy Redeemer, involved in all kinds of really cool stuff. Open Table Conference. If you're familiar with that, you know that that means people like Brad Jersak and Paul Young and a litany of names that y'all would recognize. But that is what we are here to talk about today with Kenneth, is what he's doing, what he's thinking. We just want to have a conversation. So welcome to the podcast, my brother.
Thanks, Nat and John. Glad to be here.
A good jumping off point for any conversation about faith and about the stuff that we're talking about is just to kind of get your story a little bit, get your background. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
So I was raised in the South by very Southern families. My father's side are all from East Tennessee. And then they had drifted down into, Florida. And on my mother's side, they're from all over the Florida, from the Panhandle to the Keys. But mostly in Central Florida and the forests, country folk. So, not city folk. My father was killed in Vietnam in 1970, just before I was 5. So that had a big impact on my coming up. My mother's father was a minister in the Church of God, Cleveland, Tennessee, and it's a Southern Pentecostal denomination. Of course, it's all over the world, but very, sort of holiness background. My mother was raised in a very holiness Pentecostal setting. By the time, my generation, they were, my parents were not quite as holiness as my mother was raised with. But until I was, 15, that was my world. My mother remarried, and he took us, this is a minister too. He was a Pentecostal minister, but took us in the charismatic sort of circles. So I saw all of that, wildness. Pentecostalism in the South was pretty mild compared to some of the stuff that they were swinging with in the charismatic movement. Yeah. And so they wrote a lot of those things for a long time. But we eventually ended up in California, and I went out to high school out there in Southern California, and college. I ended up, after a year in Southern California at an Assemblies of God school, I was at Oral Roberts for several years. And that was the place, the crucible of ORU was the place where my faith really started. I started asking lots, interrogating a lot of my, of the traditions and things that I was raised with and what I was being taught or what was being said, and those chapel services and things. Is this the faith? Is this what we believe? So, yeah, and there was a particular moment, we can talk about it, but I have talked about this, so I don't want to dwell on it too much, but the shuttle Challenger had blown up that morning, and January and winter morning, and we went to chapel, which we had to do several times a week. And the man who was leading the chapel got up and said, "Hey, this is a horrible thing that's happened. We, feel for their families, whatever, but we're here to praise God." And they went into this hootenanny of praise and, drums and guitars and singers and stuff. And about a minute into that, I just sat down. I was like, I can't do this. If we can't deal with what's actually happening in the world outside this space, then we got problems, and the survivability of faith in so many of my friends, and this is the mid 80s, in Oklahoma, and these kids came from all over the United States. But I noticed very early in my adult life, my late 80s, early 90s, that many of my friends that were, that I was co-eds with at ORU just simply left the faith. I mean, because you get outside of a space like that and find out that the thing that they're shilling there, which is so distant from the core convictions and practices of the first Christians, it doesn't really work in the real world. And so I was very graced to find some books and some teachers while I was there that introduced me to the first Christians. And it was shortly after this incident in chapel that I read Irenaeus, and I began to realize that these first Christians believed that God came to earth to suffer, and that God entered into human experience and existence in order to himself die, and that this descent of God into the suffering, involves everyone and everything. In that sense, is universal. So now, a God who suffers, a God who, takes on human flesh and all of the challenges of being human, who also made everything, that was interesting to me. That I realized has something to do with actual life. And because suffering and dying, that's a big part of life.
Yeah.
We were operating in some forms of denial of, what was happening in the world. You either, if there was always a reason, if you weren't doing well financially, or you weren't, your physical body was suffering, there was something that you weren't doing. It's really strange that people, who are heirs of the Protestant Reformation came to believe that there's a certain kind of heir of the Protestant Reformation came to believe that you're basically, you were back to Mesopotamia. You've got a God who you have to do things for, or you don't have favor with him. Or, your faith in him isn't strong enough, and it's a quality of your faith, what you are doing that brings about wellness and goodness and so forth and so on, instead of this is something God does for the world that God loves, is to reconcile and redeem, participate in everything that we're suffering, but also to reconcile and redeem us from that. So that was a big turning point. And then, of course, there's decades since. But
I grew up in and John did too, but just John's little background that we mentioned from time to time is that he walked away from church for a good long time, and I dutifully stayed, even though in my mind I left. But one of the things that I discovered through my process of deconstruction, which is a term we keep coming back to, even though I realize we've overused it and sometimes misused it. But regardless, this evolution that I think we continually undergo, is the shallowness of my faith as a Protestant, the shallowness of my faith as a certain brand of Protestant, I should say, where intellectual discovery was absolutely discouraged at every turn. Seminary was called cemetery. That's where your faith went to die. Knowledge was not power. Knowledge was the death of any kind of authentic, relationship with God. And so, my experience with, the first Christians wouldn't come until my 40s, until I'd already been through Bible school and done some other things. And I'm woefully, painfully ignorant of actual, what historic apostolic Christian faith looks like. And they sound like heretics to me.
Yeah.
Is that been your experience as well a little bit?
Well, yeah. I mean, there was quite a bit of, fear for my parents around my going to university and leaving behind a simple faith. They didn't like all the books that I was reading. They didn't like the people that I was being influenced by until they did. That's been I think one of the graces for me was I had parents that were concerned for a while, and then they started listening, because they were undergoing some of the same journey. And in many respects, it was something I did with my parents eventually, and after I left school and we were doing church together, and I started handing books to my dad, and my dad was like, "Oh, wow, this is amazing." And so it was fun to do that together. But there, obviously we came out of movements that, disdained the life of the mind and that were suspicious. Even though, of course, the New Testament and the Old Testament are full of meditation, contemplation, discourse, and argumentation, and everything that very much involves the mind's apprehension and understanding of God. There's the mind of Christ, from the mind that's in the church.
Right. Aren't we supposed to renew our minds, right?
So yes, it's difficult when you're battling, institutions or cultures of church that are suspicious. But what we found out, and I know this is certainly your experience too, the emotions can only take you so far. And, services and ideas and ways of doing faith that are grounded only in emotional highs don't last. Just like anything that's grounded in you're having an emotional high doesn't last. Because again, it doesn't fit the real world of, that we don't stay we don't stay in mountaintop experiences in our life. Bad things happen in this world. So,
yeah. And then young, inexperienced pastors like me jump in and, try to manufacture then experiences, because that's what we've come to associate with God's presence is an experience of God's presence versus, constantly living in an awareness of God's presence, which is way different. And not that those things, I think there were very real and tangible experiences of God's presence, but they could not be manufactured, no matter how we tried, or the songs we tried to play, or the mood we tried to set, or the, whatever else we did. But this notion of, or this word holiness has come up a couple of times in podcasts in specific relationship to a church movement. And I'm not sure that everyone listening to us knows what a holiness church is.
Yeah. So my mother was raised, right? My mother was raised in a environment in which you did not go to films. You did not go to theatrical performances. The women did not wear slacks. The men did not, the men cut their hair. Women didn't. Women didn't wear jewelry or makeup. There's lots of rules,
Right.
It's very external. You can sort of derive things like this out of scripture if you're reading it for that. And so there's a lot of emphasis on what you look like and where you're going. And obviously, drinking or smoking or, dancing and that sort of thing was verboten. And so, yeah, it became very quickly, become a works oriented, what you're doing is what saves you, thing. It also, in my experience, was just a cover for all kinds of, actually worse mentalities and behaviors underneath the veneer of, godliness, because no one's allowed to walk into the church and show their wounds, like God does when God shows up. So, it was about covering over the human struggle. And so there wasn't a lot of honesty in it at times. I mean, I did, obviously I ran into people who practiced all those things, but that wasn't the ground of their faith. The ground of their faith was a deep love for Jesus, a deep love for their neighbor. They were hardworking, cared for the poor. I'm describing my grandparents. They loved Jesus. They loved reading the scriptures. They loved praying for their families. They loved inviting the poor into their homes and having meals with them and so forth. It was for the genuine practitioner. It was just a way of being different in the world, like the Hasidic, right? And others who just have, a different way of doing life that, keeps things that they cherish alive. But it can also be very quickly become something where you're working out your own salvation and where you measure everyone else, based on these behaviors. Doesn't have to, but it often does.
Well, interesting. I actually worked for a pastor, went to a church once, and that's where I was first introduced to that, that sect. And he always spoke very negatively of it. Although, like you mentioned, a lot of this is rooted in authentic desire to do the best you can to follow God and to do the things that you want. And one of those things I think that I struggle with the most is, as I evolve and move beyond these things, is not to disdain other people's thought processes and go, well, you're just dumb for thinking that. Well, that it's just another concrete mindset. So I'm trying to honor the fact that people are all on a spectrum of growth.
It's complex.
It is complex.
And love teaches us to look for the complexity, and love teaches us to honor people where they are, and love teaches us to look for the good, but also to name what's wrong. And if you've got a church community or a civic community or whatever that has a lot of external rules and regulations, there are profound temptations to cover up what is actually going on inside the human heart and what is actually going on in the community for the sake of the standard, right? And instead of actually allowing the Spirit of God to do the work in us, and unless we recognize for instance, there's a lot, we sort of tend to name externally these different types of activities and as evil, when we need to examine, whether going to a sporting event is bad, or going to a theatrical performance is bad, or wearing makeup is bad, or whatever. There are things that obviously are much worse, enslaving someone, or, not paying someone a fair wage for their work, or abusing someone, and so forth. And you can have all of these standards about things that really make no difference, and not really be getting at the heart of what injustice is, or what, is true darkness. So, yeah, all of these things constantly have to be examined with our minds, which God gave us. And, what does it mean? And so I try to interrogate my own heart and mind. I try to drag all these experiences. I try to drag everything to the foot of the cross, where, we are standing in front of the human God, who is giving his life for the life of the world, who is becoming human by dying, and who loves the world, and then interrogate whatever practices or beliefs or superstitions or, institutional structures or whatever, that we have in front of him. And do they still hold up, in front of the bleeding, wounded God who says, forgive them because they don't know what they're doing? I was talking with a group of Methodist ministers this morning. We meet every Monday morning just to for a sanity check. We're pastors. I think there's a Baptist. They're mostly Methodist, but I'm the only, I think I'm the only sort of Anglican guy in the group. But, I was just saying this morning, we were talking about PSA, penal substitution, and why people cling to it so much. And I said, just take that idea of the cross to the cross, I mean, go to the cross with that idea. Is your first thought, looking upon this human being being slain, why did God do this to him? Is that the first thought that you would have? No, it's not. Anyway, I think we could take all of history, all of our personal lives, everything about our communities, all of the superstitions and all of the mores of our cultures and everything to that place, and then let it be judged by that moment.
I mean, I think you bring up a good point when you're talking about penal substitutionary atonement and this idea that God, I think we jokingly, but there's a lot of truth into what they believe, and that is that God hated us so much that God killed God to save us from God, right? But I think what we fail to recognize, or what we fail to see, is like when God chose to become human, to walk among us, the moment that decision was made, Jesus was going to die. There was going to be a death, right? But we want to live in that crucifixion moment because it's so cathartic, or whatever you want to call it. But he was going to die one way or the other. Jesus was going to die. And I feel like we gloss over everything up to that point, everything up to the cross. And we don't take seriously the knowledge that he was human, that he was going to at some point die in some way, shape, or form. And that we want to live in this idea that the only reason he was brought to earth, or whatever you want to call it, however you want to describe it, was to be crucified. And I think by doing that, we miss so much of what that story is telling us about what I think you were saying, was that he's here to join in our grief, in our sadness, in our brokenness, and all of that. But because we just live in that one moment of the crucifixion, that we miss all of that. How can we recognize better this broader understanding of what this incarnation meant, what Jesus' life meant to us?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of profound wisdom in meditating that we can realize, and meditating on, Mary's cooperation with the divine community and saying yes to God, and letting the Son who creates the world, he's the Word of the Father who spoke all things into being, and he cannot be contained, is now contained, in the womb of a Palestinian Jewish teenager, and that he submits himself to this profound weakness, that he is born of her and then has to be nourished by her, swaddled by her, cared for her by her, or he dies. Literally. I mean, God has made himself completely dependent upon this mother and on her stepfather, Joseph, for everything. Shelter, food, clothing. I have this meditation about, where she, after her labor and the sweat and the dirt and the breath and the blood and the amniotic fluid and everything else, she lays him after that struggle in the feed trough, which should automatically start making us wonder, like, okay, God's being placed in a feed trough. What does that mean that God, why did he come? To become bread, right? To become food for us as well. That's another whole mystery, another thing we can talk about. But, she lays him in that feed trough, and now he's breathing in time with her and the animals, and he's looking up at the stars that he placed in the sky, the wood of the manger, the stone of the manger, whatever it was. He is as God holding together, but he's also absolutely unable to do anything in his humanity as a child, as a baby, to do anything to care for himself. What does that mean? Just sit with that for a few weeks, you know? So we can go on and on through the story, right? Irenaeus says that he makes holy every stage of human existence. You know, when he falls as a child, and skins his knee or cuts his finger or whatever he's got to run to this woman for comfort and support and everything else. And, you know, he learns how to talk. The one who is the font of all knowledge, of all language, of all meaning, who gives breath and language to everyone, including the whales and the dolphins. Everybody speaks in their own tongue, and all the diverse languages of humanity, has to learn to speak by his mother. He's unable to speak, so he submits to silence until, in the mystery of his humanity, he begins to learn to talk by listening to his mother say words like Emma, or Abba, mother, father, and so forth. And as he learns the language, the Aramaic that they were speaking, the mystery of who he is as the eternal source of everything begins to reveal itself. You know, by the time he's 12 in the temple, he's astonishing, all of the learned men there. Because not only because he probably studied with Philo down in Egypt, or some of the best people in Alexandria or whatever, but, because, he is God. And I could stay, John, I could stay with this for a little bit, John. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, everywhere he goes in his life, he's a walking, talking tree of life. I mean, everywhere he goes, death flees, life comes, oppression and shackles are broken. Everywhere he goes, he only brings liberation. He only brings health. He only brings peace and so forth. And, healing and life, he's not, this is why, it begins to crumble all these ideas that, are in the human heart and false projections of who God is. He's not the life dealer and the death dealer. No, he only brings life. He's not taking up the sword. He's telling us to put our swords away. And, he's not cursing, the human, person, or, he's blessing. So, then we have to look at this entire right up. And of course, all of it's, as you say, leading to death, all of this as a revelation of what it means to be God, as the revelation of what it means to be human in one person. And what does that say about existence, about the world, about life and death and everything else?
I love the idea that, in Jesus, in his humanity, is showing us how to reconnect with divinity. What does that say about our ability to reunite those things and say, okay, fine, the story of separation always has been a lie. And then Jesus didn't come to die. I don't know that we can say that was specifically the purpose, but to reveal the connection between God and man and to show us what it means to be truly human. What are your thoughts? That I don't like I don't like the idea that God was somehow predestined. Like this was the plan. The crucifixion was the plan from day one. I do like the idea that it was inevitable. I think that we would, if Jesus showed up on the earth today, we'd murder him again.
No doubt.
Such as human nature. I think we'd
all.
Well,
let's be clear about who would murder him.
Oh, we would.
The church. The church would murder Jesus. Come on.
Yeah. And the politicians would join up and we'd all join hands and have a big party.
No, it would be an act, as it was at that moment. It would be an act of the church and the state together.
Yeah. So, and we like to imagine ourselves on the right side of that.
Right. And it doesn't help at all to say, well, it wouldn't happen in Japan, but it would happen in America, or it wouldn't happen in Russia, but it would happen in Senegal or whatever. No, the state and the religion of whatever human organization or culture you find at the time is going to crucify God. I mean, this is so.
Yeah. I mean, that's Plato said this centuries ago, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I do think what we want to avoid is the cross, and that moment has been so badly distorted, right? And what we were raised in, and what so many people are raised in. We don't want to make the opposite of an error of making it is very, very important part of the story of God with humanity. We just want to be able to proclaim it with wisdom, which is to understand that it's God submitting to our violence, submitting to that shame, submitting to, and that's what Paul's talking about in Philippians 2 when he says the humility of God. It was not becoming human, but dying, and in that particular way, at the hands of our violence, and all the preachers in Acts are so clear about this. We're the ones who kill God. God's the one who raises him up. So we just want to be clear about what's going on there, but it is really a vital and an important part of it. And there is God wanting to, I'm always telling people that I talk to, because, we're raised with these mentalities that everyone's separated from God, until we show up and we start talking to them about, how to reconnect with God. But this isn't our wisdom. Our wisdom is that Christ is already related to every human being in at least two ways. One is that he is, as God, their creator. So the one who creates and knits in the womb is the one God. And also that Jesus is the human brother of every person. So he shares our human nature. So the one human nature there's not many human natures. There's one human nature. The first Christians were very clear about this. So he takes on the one human nature that every human being shares. And it's because he shares the one human nature and dies in the way that he does, descends to death in the way, this is very Athanasian. He sees, this isn't on the incarnation, this is in Against the Gentiles, which is the first book of the two-part, where, he sees humanity falling not just into the grave, but his whole creation descending down into the non-existence from which it came. And it's impermanence. And he does not desire that humans or his creation perish, but that they participate in his permanence. And so he falls, right, not down into being human, which is, being human is God created as good. There's nothing, it's not bad to become human. He descends and is humble, becomes a servant of all humanity in his creation by falling not just into death, but into the grave and beyond the grave towards the lowest falling human who's falling toward non-existence, and raises us back up into the life of God. The one human nature. And so I love that icon that we discovered. All the Anastasis icons show him pulling Adam and Eve up, from the grave with himself, right? But that one, the monk that we discovered at Easter, Brad and I did, this monk in Greece who's painted this one where, you could just see literally all of humanity coming up out of the grave with Jesus, restoring us not just to paradise, but into the very divine, into the very life of God, that humanity. So Athanasius says, God becomes man so that man can become God, and so,
right.
Yeah. Participate in the divine life. So that's the big story, right, John, that we want to recover, is that God becomes human in order to bring all of us up into his kind of life. And as it turns out, and, N.T. Wright's been the person who's helped everybody understand this best, but, that's God in the end. God's dwelling is with humanity. This earth is restored. The creation is restored along with humanity. God's interested in saving this world, and he's interested in saving everyone, so that's good news.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that I've struggled with over the years is that, and we just got through Easter. I pastor a small church in West Texas. And my experience at Easter has gotten so much deeper. My experience of Easter has gotten so much richer as I start to see the enormity of what actually happened but then it also I get sad because I think about the faith traditions in which I was raised, where Easter was really good news for a few people. And it was a veritable shit show for everybody else.
Yeah.
Because God came to save y'all, and then I read John Chrysostom's Paschal homily and my heart explodes.
Oh, yeah.
And I go, oh, okay, death is embittered. Why? Because he was mocked and shamed. Death was rejected. Death is overcome. And it's so victorious. And we've talked about this with Brad a bunch because I just gave myself chills talking about it.
I know.
Hopeful. And I don't know, it makes me sad to think that there are people who don't view this as the enormous event that it was. And we're not preaching that good news. Why aren't we preaching that good news?
Yeah, the sacred year helps us too. And I mean, you don't have to be part of a liturgical practicing, community, a sacred year practicing community. One of the things that one of my early mentors, Bob Weber, loved was like going into Baptist or free church settings, charismatic churches and so forth, and saying, hey, look, here's this great gift, the sacred year that the first Christians give us that helps us to really enter into the mystery of these saving moments. And, one of the things we discover is that Easter is too great a mystery for one Sunday celebration. Well, I've been able to preach resurrection 2 Sundays in a row now, and there's several more coming up. I'm preaching on the resurrection again this Sunday. And we look at all of those texts and we look at what does resurrection mean? It means more than just my particular survival of death, like God, I'm going to survive death and so forth and so on. It means so much more. And it gives us time to every year to marinate in the reality of what is Easter. Same thing with Christmas, same thing, with Lent, helps us to ponder the cross and so forth. And, it's a great tool. I think I don't want to get too much into it, but I think it's the form of discipleship that is most effective, in helping people to understand and come to a deeper understanding of who the human God is and how they have by grace, by the activity of God, become participants in his life. And as John says, that's a life that begins in the life of God and that continues in the life of God. And there's just so much to meditate on.
And unfortunately, and I've done this, so I know this isn't shocking to most people. We use these holiday Sundays as a way to bring in the people that are unchurched, right?
Yeah.
That I freely admit that when I was associate pastor, I thought this way.
Yeah.
This is my chance to save the people who don't come into church on a regular basis. And we don't go deep. We don't, like Nat was saying, we don't go into this liturgical stuff because all we're doing is we're trying to check off how many people did we bring in on a Sunday service or a Christmas service or you name it. There's, all these services. And it's not about giving them the life-giving message. It's about, hey, can we save another soul? And we get lost in the numbers.
What did Paul call it, John? What did he call it? He said check marks for Jesus.
Yeah, check marks for Jesus. Yeah,
we got to get our check marks for Jesus, man.
Yeah, it's almost to think about that as a motivation and to realize how much that participates in a corporatist, consumerist idea, right? You almost begin to see the blasphemy, in that way of approaching the mysteries that, this particular human life has introduced us to. Yeah, this is not a growth industry. This is not this is not a numbers game. This is not about competition with other worldviews, with other philosophies. There's nothing about competition in this. It's not about winning. It's about losing, and losing everything for everything, and so it's the opposite of what God does, which is, God doesn't show up Jesus does not come back and present himself before Pilate. He does not come back and present himself before Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, which is if we were projecting a God, this is what we would do. He would be like someone in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Look, you tried to kill me, but you weren't successful.
So boom.
I actually won because I'm still, alive, and you're going to die, in 5 years or 10 years or whatever. But I'm, whatever you did your worst to me, I'm back. That's not the gospel. He shows up in these, he shows up to love, he shows up to longing, to pain, to desire, for him, to people who are deeply saddened by the loss of his company, and to give them hope. And of course, he appears to them, to those who, imagine if he had appeared to Pilate or Caiaphas, all that would have happened was them been deeply afraid and freaked out, almost like, the idea was this be vengeance or whatever. No, he shows up to those who, he had walked with and talked with for years and suffered with and taught and so forth, in order to, invite them into his kind of life. He breathes on them, breathes the Spirit on them. And the next thing that happens after he breathes the Spirit on them is they don't speak in tongues. He commissions them to go and to proclaim forgiveness, the forgiveness of sins, and invite everyone into that, to proclaim that he's forgiven sins, and that we are now to forgive sins. And the anticipation is that in these small, ragtag people, that an actual continuation of his life in the world would, we would be his hands and his feet and his heart and his mind and his life. And that we would begin to bring that to people in genuine ways that actually make a difference in their life and in the life of the world. And gradually everyone would come to see that this way of humility, this way of death, this way of forgiveness, this way of defeat, this way of weakness was actually what holds everything together. What causes all the planets to be in their gravitational orbits, and causes the grass to come up from the ground, and causes us to be able to breathe, is this, weakness.
And don't we? Isn't it interesting that at this moment, that after the resurrection, where Jesus does come to the people that he had been with, and don't you think that if any place he was going to say something like, hey, so now for you to enter into this life, here are the rules. Here are the plans. Here is the list. Here's the sinner's prayer you need to say. If any place in the scriptures where you would think you were going to find this is where it would be. And it's not. Nothing there gives you anything you need to do than to just understand that you are part of this divine dance.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how do we lose that? I mean, I know the answer to some of this, but why do we buy into the bullshit that says, no, yeah, that's great and all, but here's the list of the stuff you have to do to be able to enter into this relationship?
It's easier to start a club and put the to put the members only sign on the door, and to say this is what gets you in and this is what keeps you out. And God, his intention was to include everyone. I mean, we can talk about the Noah story, but Noah preaches and the animals are the only ones that listen. He gets on the ark, and then they're the only ones that respond. He preaches to the animal. He saves the animals. Great. Then Abraham, he comes in Abraham, and the whole idea is he says to Abraham right away, this is about not just blessing you and your family, but everyone. And Israel loses that message that it's about saving everyone, and they make it about themselves. And by the time Jesus shows up, they've completely misunderstood the prophets. They've completely misunderstood all their wisdom literature and so forth. And they have all their rules and who's in and who's out. The church is no different. I do think that we really need to read the New Testament and even the Old Testament as a diagnosis of our own maladies and of our own, what we've done with the revelation of God that's been given to us, is create barriers, create boundaries, create systems, create rules, create this, create that. And it actually, and so Jesus is telling the folks at the temple, you have created barriers between God and the creation, between God and human beings. And he reserves his greatest judgment for them. And I think the church has done this. The church has done the same thing. We have to confess that this is what we've done. We have to repent, from having done it, which means 180 degree, and turn we have to make and head toward what is the story of the world, what's the story of God, and what's the story of God's world, and get back to that and recognize that it's a universal mission.
Yeah. Well, and what's the role of weakness in all of this? I just got finished reading through. I was reading Capon, and in preparation for a sermon series I'm doing on parables, because who better than Capon? But anyway, and he makes this point when we're talking about the parables of lost things, and it actually opens that book with a whole discussion of left-handed power, which I still find just mind-blowing and remarkable.
Yeah, that's a really brilliant passage.
But the idea that God's power is always seen, or anyway, in Jesus, what we see as God's power is indirect. That they're not passive, but not forceful. Certainly not the kind of power that an empire like Rome would have demonstrated. And so it confounds everybody when Jesus shows up and his victory is clothed in what looks like defeat, and his power is clothed in what looks like victory, or in like weakness. And so what's your take on that sort of paradox of the crucified God, the cruciform God, demonstrating power by submitting to our violence and then overcoming and redeeming it, perhaps? I don't know. I'm not sure how you'd say that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he shows it to be, he shows that, just demonstrations of power to be actually ephemeral. They don't, they come and go. They don't last. The sands of time and the material universe causes power to dissipate. And so you can only ever have a momentary demonstration of that kind of power. God, the weakness of God reveals that, all of that is empty, actually. And that, so I think it probably, we have to get back to like, how does this affect the way we are in the world. And I think one of the things that, when people project the end, and Christians have done this for the last several hundred years in ways that are, really not very helpful. And, they'll talk a lot about, Jesus coming back as someone completely other than, what he shows up as, or what he ascends to the Father as a, military badass, basically, who's, going to come back and set everything right using the same means that we would use as humans, but on a cosmic scale.
Right. The same ones that put him on the cross.
Yeah. I mean, he just shows up as the cosmic Genghis Khan, right? Or the cosmic Patton, or the cosmic Rommel. I mean, he's just, or Sherman, whatever. He shows up as the greatest general that humans can project. And he kills more people than anyone else killed before, or whatever. But actually, I think, and again, who knows what the end looks like, but to me, what makes gospel sense would be that people who are following the risen God, the wounded God, would en masse be killed in the same way that God was killed, by violence, by world systems, by Satan and the demonic power. And that would be the end. And that the Spirit of God would show up and raise the church to newness of life out of that final violence. That makes much more sense to me than all of this kind of escapist nonsense. It definitely makes more sense than the escapist nonsense that there would be a worldwide sacrifice of the body of Christ for the nations, and that the Spirit of God, after a Holy Saturday of some kind, would raise us all back up and raise everyone else, into the life of God. Because there was a group of humans who are his brothers and sisters, his presence in the world, who finally were willing to lay down self-defense and self-preservation and all the bullshit that, can I use that word?
Yes.
That John was talking about, of competition and winning and all of this kind of stuff. And, submit to that same weakness, and that God would, of course, raise us all to life in himself in this world.
Yeah, I always find it very strange that, at least in the church circles in which I have spent a lot of time, the idea of submitting to somebody else's violence is anathema or anathema to anything we would ever think of as Christ, right? Like, because in our viewpoint, sure, Jesus was meek and mild the first go around, but he's coming back and he's pissed, this time, and I love that. Anybody can proof text. They're like, well, Jesus is coming back, and his robe is dipped in blood. And then Brian Zond comes along and says, yeah, but it's his own blood. So, let's read the text.
We're getting ready to do that. We're going to do a 24-week study of Revelation online. And Brian's going to be part of that. It's going to be John Bear, myself, Brad Jersek, Cherith, Nordling, Paul Young, John McMurray. And Brian and Julie and Chris Green are going to be our guests on that show. And we're going to try to get, obviously to start understanding what that book's all even about in the first Christians, and how controversial it was that it was even included in the Bible. But there's a way of reading it, that's consistent with the Gospels and the rest of Scripture and wisdom, which, we haven't been reading it very wisely. So
yeah. Mine was a comic book form.
Yeah.
And it was all literally transferred into 20th century paradigms of, Russia, and, we're going to battle with the great Satan, which is going to be, and then, these symbolic creatures are actually the attack helicopters of the communists are coming. And, I got the late great planet Earth, and we got the whole, that predates even any of the Left Behind crap. It was always Hal Lindsey and his, late great planet Earth. And, we were all scared to death of the rapture because I didn't want to be caught doing something I wasn't supposed to be doing.
Yeah, no doubt.
So,
the other one was what was it called? The Thief in the Night? Was that the other book, The Thief in the Night?
Yeah.
I wouldn't read that one. It scared me.
Which was made into like just a horrible movie.
I was marched into a church building when I was 8 years old and at night, and watched that with, all kinds of other children and families and stuff like that. And yeah, it scares the bejesus out of you, I mean, of course,
yeah,
because you got, the father disappears and you've got the shaking electrical razor and the sink
and the plane that's flying itself and
clothing laid out across the sidewalk where, somebody's walking along one moment, the next moment. I guess you don't need clothes in the rapture. Anyway, I never knew why the clothes didn't go, but I'll tell you that what stuff like that does to you. I came home from school one afternoon, and there was a pot of water boiling, sort of thing that my mom would set to boil to make tea or Southern, sweet tea or something. And it was left boiling there. And that was pretty unusual for my mom because we'd had a small kitchen fire where the fire department had to come out. So she would never leave stuff like that going on the stove. And I start looking through the house, and my heart starts getting more and more. I start getting more and more anxious. My heart is racing. I can't find her anywhere in the house, but the cars are in the driveway and there's boiling water on the stove. And finally, I'm like outside running around like, Mom, where are you? And I find her, in the backyard talking to someone else. But in the meantime, in my head, that Larry Norman song going, and I'm waiting for the, black helicopters. They're going to pick me up and they're going to I've been left behind, man. And the next thing that's going to happen is my head's going to get chopped off, So, yeah.
Jeez.
Isn't that silly? And how far from the gospel is that? That's light years from the gospel. It really is.
That is light years. It's galaxies away. As I like to talk about, like evangelical Christianity, traumatizing children since, whenever. Because, we teach you to pray that, if I should die before I wake, which is a thought that any 3-year-old should probably not have. And then we teach them to be deathly afraid of what awaits them on the other side of that. And then we teach them to be deathly afraid of being snatched away in the night, or not being snatched away. Actually, it's the ones who are left behind who are screwed. So there's too much trafficking and fear. And one of the beautiful things that I appreciate about guys like you and about guys like Brad and Brian and those who are turning us back towards a more authentic and a more beautiful gospel is the attempt to take seriously the idea that perfect love casts out fear, and so for that, I'm grateful. And I constantly point people towards people like you, towards people like Brad, who will fill their hearts with hope, remind them that the gospel is in fact good news, that Jesus didn't just come for good little boys and girls, that he came for the sick and the wounded and the broken, and that there's hope on the other side of that. And there's hope now. That's the other part of that really bothers me, is so much emphasis placed on the sweet by and by that we seem to not give a rip about the hells people are in now. And I know that that's not true for you. I know that's not true for your church, that you guys do a lot to help alleviate and suffer with people. So for that, I'm super grateful.
Yeah. I mean, for just talking about children, I just want to say, Jesus is the one who invites the children, to sit on his lap, imagine sitting on the lap of God and having that as a memory, as an adult, that when you were a child, you sat on the God's lap. I think we want to fill the minds of children with the majesty and beauty and glory of the story. And, because we need hope. And as you said, it is very now oriented. This is the gospel. One of the things about all of scriptural wisdom, really, and the encounter that happens with the human God, is that right now is the only, my friend John Bear likes to say, every moment of time is the last moment of time. And I think I think that is a very important wisdom to get into your heart if you're going to follow the human God, is that, the past is gone. There's no accessing even, the beginning of our conversation an hour ago, I can't get back there. And I cannot project myself into tomorrow or 2 weeks from now or 6 months from now when hopefully the pandemic is over. I am, as a human being, bound to this moment. The good news is that that's where God is. God is here in the present moment, and yes, he's in the future, and yes, he's in the past, but this is the only moment of time I have. John Bear takes us to, philosophical heights with the reality that the past is gone and the future doesn't exist. And so that literally, just right now is what exists. Nothing else exists except this present moment. And so that's also reorients us to I don't like, what word would I want to use? I think the weight, I think is the right word, not the urgency, but the weight of the present moment. And so where God is speaking, where God is acting, both to save the cosmos and to save everyone. So, where is he? I had this friend named Jack Heaslip, who's a priest of the Church of Ireland, wonderful man. And he used to say, especially people that get caught up in what is God's will for me, or what am I supposed to be doing with my life, and get really, really concerned about that. It's just to notice, where is God already at work in the present moment? Because he is already at work everywhere in the present moment, and join God in what God is doing already. And so, we know that it's his desire to preserve the creation and to preserve humanity, and for everyone to exist in the shalom that he brings. And so I can find a way to, be the hands of God, mind of God, the heart of God, the courage of God, the peace of God, the love of God, and by the power of the Spirit, not because I'm someone special, or have special DNA or cells or, thoughts or whatever, but because I can participate by the Spirit in the work of the human God. So just get to work wherever I am, bringing about the end that God desires. And he'll take all of that work up into a ultimate moment in which, ultimate present moment in which everything is as it should be. But I don't, it's not the task of the human to sit and wait for that to happen. It's the task of the human right now in the present moment to join God.
As you're talking, I'm having this picture in my head, but I'm having this picture in my mind of God speaking the world into existence, and that process is ongoing. And so the future that we wring our hands about and the future that we worry about hasn't even happened yet. And I don't think even you can say that God exists out of time if you want to. I'm not so sure that I'm there. I believe this creation is still an ongoing process. And I'm not sure if that resonates with you or if I'm full of crap. So,
it has to be, right? I mean, first of all, there's the creation, and the creation continues to become. we know that there are new species of animals that didn't exist before that exist now. That there were species of animals that used to exist that don't anymore. Same thing with the flora and the fauna, and there are new human beings coming into existence all the time, literally all the time, all over the planet. And there was no existence for those human beings before the moment that they were conceived in their mother's womb, not according to the Christian story. So, it's absolutely. And then there's the new creation that's happening, in the humanity of Jesus. We were born from our mothers, but then we're born from above. That's what's beautiful about, John 20 and 20, I think it's about 22, 23, where, he breathes on the receive the Holy Spirit. That's the only where that breath, occurring there is the only time that word appears in the New Testament. And it has it is the same Greek word that's used in the Septuagint in the Greek Old Testament that would have been what was largely circulating in the time of Christ. It's the same word where it says that God breathed life into the nostrils of the inanimate Adam. His body formed on the ground, perfectly fine, but without life, and not dead, but, formed from the ground. And God breathes into him and animates his body. So this new creation is happening, simultaneously. One day, everything that's created will also be newly, created after that, the new creation that gets unleashed in the world and the death and resurrection of God. Yeah, absolutely. I love that.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And it flies in the face of any sense that Calvin would have given us, of this sort of predetermined, mapped out future that we're all just, kind of riding along on. When I was a kid, remember those racetracks, John, we had when we were kids, little grooved racetracks that the cars would go on, these little that's always sort of how I felt like Calvinism was. Like, hey, I'm going to stick you in this little path, and you can't really deviate from this, because that's where you're going to go. And you might have the illusion of choice, but you don't actually have choice. But doesn't that sort of presuppose that future exists already, and I'm just sort of walking into it?
Yeah, I think it's more like we trust that the ultimate end of all human choices, God is at work underneath, above, around, all of it to bring about, as only God can do, a good end.
Right.
Only God can make the cross life for everyone. Only God can bring good from evil. Now, he doesn't need evil. He doesn't cooperate with evil. He doesn't participate in evil, but he can, and only God can do this, is he can cause good to come from it. So, yeah, it's, again, like in that sense, all of my choices, are predestined to end up in God's good, they'll be, somehow redeemed into, the world that God's bringing to this world. And anything of it that cannot be redeemed will be destroyed,
Right.
So.
Right. So in that sense, we can buy off on some sense of predetermination, in that ultimately we trust God to redeem and to make sense of even our stupid choices.
Yeah, but it's not atomized down to like, I put this black sweater on, before we started talking, because God, that's God's will, and that's where you get someone who seems to be perfectly reasonable a lot of the time. John Piper, for instance, who's reasonable a lot of the time. He sounds like a very reasonable person. Will say things like, if someone comes up and blows this building up, I cannot be angry with them because God sent that person into the building to blow the building up, which is just,
And then you just go, yeah, but he's painted himself into a corner with that, hasn't he? I mean, he either has to recognize his own inconsistencies, or he has to take it to its logical or illogical conclusion.
Yeah.
I remember hearing him talk one time, and he spoke, and I'm not picking on Piper. He's too easy a target. But there was, he was bragging on himself in a sense for telling his daughter, who at bedtime was asking about a bridge that had collapsed and killed a bunch of people. And, did God do that? And I told her, yes. And he's glorified through it. And I said to myself, you are it's child abuse. You're raising this kid to think that God is evil. We're calling evil good and good evil. And it just, I just can't abide it. So
can we also, though, swing the pendulum too far the other way and saying, well, God doesn't control, I don't want to use that word. God isn't involved in anything, and everything is our free will choice.
No, of course
because
not.
I think that, well, first of all, I think we don't understand free will at all.
No, probably not.
We don't hold enough knowledge in our head of what God is about to even say that free will exists in the way that we talk about it.
Absolutely. Or everything, when we start getting into some of these things, everything we're saying is contingent on the fact that we only have we have a limited apprehension of the world and of time and of God and of ourselves and everything else. And that we have self-deception, about ourselves and obviously wrong ways of thinking about existence. And I mean, I constantly, if we're honest, we're constantly coming up on things we didn't know, about ourselves, about the world and so forth. So absolutely. There's some things that, we can have a reasonable certitude, that we know what we're talking about. But it's very limited, and everything else is trust.
I mean, I can't speak, like I was saying, I can't speak for Nat, but I mean, this is kind of where I lay my hat now is like, if it's not life-giving and if it's not based in love, then I can put it aside. And, it's not, we can debate it. We can talk about it academically. We can do all that. But if it's not life-giving and not based in love, it's just, I think this phrase has been coming up a lot. I just no longer have the bandwidth to take the time to worry about it. It'll sort itself out at some point, but it seems like, just spinning wheels for spinning wheels' sake.
Yeah. No, and I do think that someone, we do have responsibility to speak well about God and, to the extent that and so I do think that there is a very severe responsibility, that someone takes upon themselves to begin to attribute evil, to God. And so I think it's okay to say, look, that doesn't fit with anything that we know about God, because our understanding of God starts with this person. And this person is so at odds with the statement that person just made. His life, his energy, his words, and what he reveals is so at odds with that statement that we just we have to plainly reject it. at the same time that we recognize that we don't understand everything the way God understands everything. But we understand it enough to say, no, that's not an accurate representation of God. With humility, But I agree with you, John. I mean, I think the older we get, right, the more we recognize there's less time to monkey around with, stuff, as you said, that doesn't bring life.
Yeah. I mean, all of my theological musings and all of my pontificating and all this other stuff, I do get to a place where I'm like John. I've boiled it down to life and death. There's we're dealing in one or the other at all times. And, you can take that for what it's worth. I don't care too much about abstract concepts of morality and holiness codes and silliness like that. But I can pretty plainly evaluate if my thought or my intention or my action harms my neighbor or myself and is either life-giving or death-dealing. And for me, that's a fairly binary choice. It's not even that difficult, So, but it gets rid of all those vagaries of, some of the silly stuff that we wrangle and argue about, What is the will of God? Well, I don't know. How about love, love justice, do mercy, walk humbly with your God. Oh, yeah. Okay. Let's start there.
Love your neighbor as yourself. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there's not a ton that we have to wrestle with. And actually, what I would say is if we were doing all those things right, then fine, let's get into the nitty gritty of some of the other stuff.
Yeah. Do justly, walk humbly do justice, love mercy, walk humbly.
Yeah. So if we can start doing those things consistently well, then maybe we have some room to talk about some of this other stuff. But we have our task cut out for us.
Yeah. And
just loving each other.
I mean, doing justice, loving mercy, and walking humbly with the God who shows us that, his love is capable of accomplishing the salvation of the cosmos. And, that gives us confidence that in the end, it's not, we're invited into participation in that, but in the end, it's God's work, it's not up to us, and I think a lot of the world's evil flows from this idea that we are the ones who have to get, X, Y, or Z done. A great bit of the world's evil flows from that conviction. And when we begin to recognize that it's our participation in the work of God's already done, and to this particular God who dies for the life of the world, then we're going to be able to, with a greater sense of shalom, less anxiety, with trust, not certitude, and, join God in loving the world. So, yeah.
Man, that's beautiful. It is beautiful. And it's in its simplicity, it's beautiful. Not that translates into easy, but simple. There's a simple truth to it.
I came into this with, sometimes Nat and I do this. We're like, hey, I'm going to kind of lean on you on this because I think you know this person a little bit better than I do. And this has just been a remarkable conversation. And I think Nat agrees. I could take this another hour. There's so much that we've just touched the surface on.
Yeah, it's good to connect with you both.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you for listening to This Is Not Church. Be sure to rate and review the podcast on your platform of choice. If you would like to partner with us, visit patreon.com/thisisnotchurch, where you will receive exclusive content such as early access to episodes, videos of upcoming episodes, and live Q&A sessions. Be sure to check out our Facebook group or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. All the links are in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode.